Only the paranoid survive.
The life and death battles of global businesses, the fatal decisions, the risks taken, the mistakes made inside the boardroom.
We will make an absolute huge amount of money if we're right.
The highest of stakes.
It was a real threat for everyone.
Driven by innovation.
All I had was something that I knew was disruptive. It was viewed to be impossible.
Blinded by fear.
Let's ignore it, because we don't really know what to do with it.
Desperate times and desperate measures.
That was the day that I had to go.
Fateful consequences.
So my only question would have been why.
And the lessons learned.
The problem was they were wrong, and it costs everything.
We're taking more of them than ever. Photos. With a camera always at hand, why not? They're free and fun. Last year, we took a whopping 1 trillion photos, according to the latest research. They're emailed, shared, uploaded across the world in an instant. They are what you might call Kodak moments.
Prior to Kodak, of course, Kodak moments did not exist in popular imagination. Now everyone understands Kodak moments as the instant which you intuitively feel needs to be preserved on film.
Actually, it's 100 years of Kodak moments, because Kodak began 1880, and for the first time ever, people were able to take pictures without having to go to an art studio and get a painting made, or without having to go to a professional photographer and have like a daguerreotype or a plate made. And it really took photography and made it mobile.
Ooh, a Kodak moment is supposed to be a happy memory.
So much for the experts. What about the rest of us?
Oh, a Kodak moment is when you capture the moment of something very special that sends that picture home.
I don't know what a Kodak moment is.
I do not know what a Kodak moment is.
And what about these youngsters in a Singapore skate park? Do they know what a Kodak moment is?
I have no idea.
I don't know.
No idea. I've seen adverts on like TV and like on YouTube for like
photo system, new from Kodak.
It's baffling. Kodak, the company that pioneered photography for the masses and dominated the world of photos for a century, has all but vanished for many consumers. So just who is or was Kodak, and why has the Kodak moment all but disappeared? To understand just what happened, we have to travel back to ancient history, the early 1990s.
Kodacolor VR films, capturing America in all its glorious colors.
Back then, Kodak was the dominant force in photography. When you thought of photos, you thought of Kodak.
Kodak was one of the giants of its era. At its peak, Kodak controlled about 80% of the film market in the United States, which is the world's largest photography market. Its name was synonymous with photography.
But the world was moving fast. A technological revolution was sweeping across the globe and altering everything it touched. We were changing, out with the analog, in with the digital. In the midst of this massive and rapid shift stood Kodak. The company was huge. At its peak, it employed 145,000 people around the world, and its profits were counted in the billions. The company seemed indomitable.
It was the ultimate blue chip stock. It invested billions of dollars over the years in making the best possible photographic film. But the gross margin on film was close to 70%. So you can imagine the kind of market share and the kind of profitability that Kodak enjoyed for a very long time.
And what's more, the giant company, by then a century old, stood poised on the verge of an amazing breakthrough, ushering in the new digital age. And this man was at the forefront.
I joined Kodak in 1973, and it At that time, Kodak was the place to work. It was like going to work at Apple, going to work at Google. The first camera that I worked on at Kodak as an engineer was part of the lunar landing program for the United States. And this camera actually went to the moon and took some of the first color shots of the moon landscape. But I was always interested in electronics my entire life. So when the technology started to come around, I started looking at how that applied to imaging. And that was my personal love, Kodak, and every time I had a chance to move my job further toward digital imaging, I would always take that job.
By the time he was a vice president in the imaging group at Kodak, Strickland led a team working on a radical new form of picture taking for the masses, the world's first consumer digital camera.
Digital imaging was a real excitement for me because it was viewed to be impossible. The first digital images were really ugly. I mean, you could barely make out a person's face. So it's just thinking, how can you, in a way that produces a business at a cost that can be afforded, combine all the technologies it takes to come up with images that can compete with photographic images? It seemed impossible to me. And the first digital camera that we made was for the professional market. And it cost like $30,000.
But technology was moving at breakneck speed. Image sensors, microprocessors, circuits, batteries, storage devices, all were getting smaller, better, and cheaper.
In 1991, a number of us had an idea about if we combine a number of these technologies at Kodak into a small package, we've got a digital camera. And we could see that in small-sized images, this camera would be good enough. And that's really what got me and a large part of my team interested in the idea that maybe there is really such a device as a consumer digital camera.
It would be like nothing Kodak had made before, a mass-market camera with no film.
Tonight, I'd like to show you one of the world's great cameras, the magnificent new Retina Reflex by Kodak.
Kodak's business model was essentially a classic razor and blade model, where you give away razors for free because you can make money by selling blades. Kodak never went into high-end still cameras. A cheap $5 camera uses the same film as an expensive $5,000 camera.
Almost no company can sell just cameras and make money. Because, of course, you buy one camera and you keep it for 25 years. And that has a very limited business model. But if you sell film and you sell processing, then you make much more money.
It's all about the film. Film had gross margins of 85%, 80%, huge.
Photographic film is at the heart of Kodak's DNA, its biggest innovation, and something which disrupted the existing world of photography. And it all took place in a town not far from New York.
I grew up near Rochester, and my grandfather worked for Kodak. He was an inventor, and pretty much, well, my uncle also worked for Kodak. Everyone in Rochester works for Kodak, or did work for Kodak up until the 80s. So I was surrounded by Kodak my whole life.
And this is the original disruptor, George Eastman, the Eastman of Eastman Kodak, a brilliant inventor who changed photography forever. Before Eastman, photography was in the hands of the professionals. Eastman made photography mobile. No longer did you have to go to a professional's studio.
One of the interesting things about the invention, the innovation of the Kodak was to make it hand-holdable and to be able to carry your camera around with you, which made it easy to take on excursions and therefore easier to make memories with. Kodak further innovated in that direction by creating folding cameras that would go in your pocket. What you would do is you would be able to open this up when you wanted to take a photograph and use this little prism as a viewer where you'd be able to see, or just range find, which means just point it in the general direction of something that you want to photograph and press the shutter. So when you finish with your Kodak, you would take all of the exposures and you would send the entire camera back to Kodak. And Kodak would, at the factory, they would process the film, put your negatives in sleeves, they would print them all, they would reload your camera, and they would send the whole thing back to you. And that's why George Eastman invented this slogan, you press the button, we do the rest.
Kodak's approach was revolutionary, but it was still a hard sell. It was, as corporate experts say, too disruptive. People needed persuading to break from the existing way of doing things, and Kodak came up with brilliant ways of making the pitch.
Kodak promoted this idea of capturing not only happiness, but youth and hipster, if you want to say. Sort of this quality of staying eternally young and freezing a moment of perfection. And they marketed through the idea of the perfect nuclear family and vacations, holidays. It is about that warm glow of people being away in the summer on the beach or having picnics, or in the winter having sledding parties, and that's what Kodak is all about. Sort of perfection, but an almost unachievable perfection.
Kodak's marketing was powerful and extensive. It slipped into the public's consciousness, changing behaviors, to the company's immense profit.
Kodak created the Kodak moment. They essentially gave you reasons to take pictures. The first thing that they did was they brought women into the fold. They created an advertising blitz which equated the idea of being a responsible housewife with somebody who keeps a meticulous record of her family's evolution and growth and records all the significant occasions in her family's life.
Surprise Charlie!
The Kodak Colorburst 250, the only instant camera with the built-in flash.
The other thing that Kodak did in terms of creating this Kodak moment was turning the idea of travel into that of vacation. With Kodak, this idea, which essentially said a holiday without a Kodak is a holiday wasted. If you've been somewhere and you don't have photos to show for it, you might as well have not gone.
And its reach extended far beyond snaps of families enjoying their holidays and of its fabled Super 8 home movies. During the 1950s, 60s, 70s and beyond, the company's pioneering technology allowed us to capture the world in extraordinary detail and clarity. And not just this world. Kodak's equipment gave us some of the great images of space and the heavens above, while its medical imaging allowed us to see deep into the workings of the human body. Underpinning everything Kodak did was consistency, global reach, the same products, the same quality, wherever you were.
Kodak played a huge role in photography because for any technology to be massively used around the world, you've got to have a platform. And the platform needs to have standards. So Kodak, by taking a platform and making everything low cost, but yet high quality, was able to drive the entire photographic industry at least for 120 years.
For Kodak, its very history and origins defined its enormous success. But as a secret project in Japan was about to reveal, Kodak's faith in film would prove too strong, and its eventual undoing. At the start of the 1990s, the giant American photography firm Kodak seemed invincible. For close to a century, its products and marketing made Kodak the dominant force in photography. If you thought of photos, you thought of Kodak. But everything was about to change. The digital and networked world was coming fast.
It's interesting that throughout human existence, we've always had change. But what's happening is the change is getting faster. And there are various estimates that the pace of change is doubling every 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. And it varies from technology to technology.
And inside Kodak, there were some visionaries who could see ahead.
We could see the potential of a consumer digital camera, but there's one little problem that actually surfaced at lunch one day, where I was talking with a number of the executives in the consumer film business. And I just happened to say, oh, I think my group can pull together a digital camera that's good enough for consumer applications. And the looks that I got at that time and the silence that followed kind of led me to believe that maybe this is going to be an uphill battle.
But so radical was the project for Kodak, whose business was based on selling photographic film, that Strickland kept it away from his bosses. It was a stealth operation.
I realized that if I had developed that camera in Rochester, New York, which is where we did most of the development, it probably would have gotten killed. So I went over and talked to our chief technology officer, who was supportive of anything new, and I said, look, you've got a research laboratory in Yokohama, Japan. What if I fund this program and we do it over in your research laboratory? Nobody in Rochester will know about it, because nobody goes to Yokohama. When they travel to Japan, they go to Tokyo.
So, in the early 1990s, in a far-flung outpost of the Kodak empire, Strickland's team set up camp and were soon making excellent progress.
All was going just fine, and until late 1992, a VP of marketing happened to be taking a tour of Asia and just happened to have been taken to Yokohama. He just happened to go by the laboratory that was doing the camera, just happened to get a demonstration of it. And that meeting on Monday morning in Rochester with the executives began by him saying, before our president finished, he said, excuse me, does everybody know what Strickland's doing in Japan? And I kind of tried to look like innocent as best I could. And he said, I had just been over there last week. He's developing a camera that doesn't take film. And he said, I saw some pictures on a computer screen and they look pretty good to me. And the body language in that room was one where I was thinking, I want to hide at this point in time.
Strickland, tipped as a possible future leader of Kodak, was ordered to give a detailed account of what he'd been up to the very next day.
I spent the night putting together a presentation, creating images, having a camera. And I give the presentation in about 45 minutes. And I look around the room, and the reaction ranged at worst from like darts and heads like this. No way, no F way are we going to do this. The most positive was, I don't get it.
It wasn't the first time that Kodak's bosses had missed the promise of digital imaging. As early as 1975, Kodak's researchers had pioneered the first digital camera.
This is one of the most amazing things. Kodak invented the first ever digital camera. So it wasn't invented by the people who then developed it into mass market, it was developed by Kodak.
When the inventors showed their new film-less photography to Kodak executives in 1976, they were puzzled and bemused. The company did file a patent, but then did nothing with the new technology. It simply set it aside. At that point, the digital future seemed very far away, and the Kodak executives returned to the business of selling film.
There's an interesting report where the response to the management, to the team that invented the first ever digital camera, was reported as being, "That's cute, but don't tell anyone."
By the time Don Strickland's secret consumer camera project was discovered, the world had moved on. Digital was gaining a rapid foothold everywhere, but the view inside Kodak hadn't changed, and it led to a difficult decision for him.
I actually lost sleep over the lack of support and also the negativity around people that did not understand and actively tried to sabotage digital photography. And I lost a lot of sleep trying to figure out what to do. Ultimately, I ended up leaving Kodak.
So what just happened? Maybe Kodak just asked the wrong questions.
Today, when people look back, they say, oh, Kodak executives were wrong. They were afraid of cannibalization. They were stupid or whatever. That's not the case. At that time, when I laid out the concepts for digital camera, I was asked very normal questions. How many units will we sell over the next 5 years? How profitable will the business be? These are all normal questions everybody gets asked to justify a business. The only problem was I couldn't answer any of them. All I had was something that I knew was disruptive.
For a company that was founded on disruptive technology itself, it seemed that Kodak had forgotten its roots.
That is symptomatic of an organisation that was built on innovation and has stopped listening to the innovators. There were a number of chances that Kodak had to A, see the signals from the market, B, listen to the innovators inside, C, listen to the innovators outside. But for some reason, they were utterly determined not to do so.
Strickland decided to move from Kodak to a struggling young company with a reputation for innovation and disruption. It was called Apple.
And they asked me different questions than the strategy questions at Kodak. At Apple, the question is really, what huge problem are you solving? What incredible value are you creating? And I could answer those. You know, digital and instant and the lack of chemicals and pollution, I could answer those easily.
Striking a licensing deal with Kodak, Strickland was allowed to bring his consumer camera technology with him to Apple.
So what I was in the fortunate position of was having developed the camera at Kodak. Kodak manufactured it and then sourced it to my group at Apple. And I launched it in early 1994 as the Apple QuickTake 100. This is the world's first consumer digital camera. It works like this.
So just what lay behind Kodak's baffling decision to block the world's first digital consumer camera, handing it and a possible future CEO into the lap of Apple?
If you look at incumbents in industries, they have resources and processes that are all vested in one direction, and then it's like trying to turn around the Titanic. And you think, okay, here's this little disruptive innovation. It doesn't fit with our gross margin. It's not enough business for us. Let's ignore it, because we don't really know what to do with it.
But ignoring it didn't mean it would go away.
Kodak was not paranoid enough. It should have been more afraid. I believe Andy Grove, who used to be the CEO of Intel, when he says only the paranoid survive. Okay? So you have to keep looking over your shoulder, what's coming, and preparing for that. Kodak was full of hubris because, and perhaps rightfully so, because they had created popular photography. They gave birth to popular photography. They were synonymous with popular photography. But they failed to break out of this world that they had created themselves.
That world was based on what Kodak executives called the silver halide strategy, named after the crucial components in photographic film. In short, it meant prolonging the use of film, and the companies seemed to do everything they could to put off the day of reckoning, trying an increasingly desperate range of hybrid technologies, such as photo CDs. Despite billions being spent, it wasn't working.
The last big failure that probably convinced everybody that there really is not a hope here was when Kodak, instead of going to the digital technologies, launched photo CD in 1992. It used digital technologies to give more utility to film. So you still used your film camera. Well, nobody wanted to do that.
When that didn't work, in another effort to prolong its film business, Kodak turned to the fast-growing Asian economies. It made a huge $1 billion bet on China. At the time, one of the biggest ever investments in the country made by an American firm.
I think Kodak at that time was looking at the next big market, thinking we own almost 90% of the film market in the US. We need to look at where the next market is. It's China. And they could see a growing middle class that had the money to buy film and buy cheaper cameras, and it made sense. Thinking, let's take a successful business model and put it somewhere else.
But it would prove to be a hopelessly optimistic move.
Kodak made a number of assumptions, which was one, we have time. The developing markets will start with film before going to digital, and we will be there in China when that happens. So it was a set of assumptions around success. So far, we've always known what our customers wanted. We've always given them what they wanted. They didn't realize that consumers in China were going to leapfrog the whole film category and go straight to digital.
As the company stumbled, its competitors began booming. But Kodak wouldn't give up without a fight. In a letter to Kodak employees in 1997, the chief executive told staff, "Competitors are making bold claims. They claim they will dominate the future of this business. We speak for the tens of thousands of people who work for Kodak when we say, not on our watch." But despite its defiance, another trend was about to disrupt photography yet again and spell doom for Kodak. While Kodak was fighting a losing battle against a new form of photography, filmless digital snaps, another massive technological change was about to make that whole battle redundant. It was a technology that would sideswipe the firm and bring it to its knees. The new technology in question is probably in your pocket right now, the smartphone. Ironically, it was foretold by Kodak. But as with digital cameras, the opportunity was missed.
When I visited Kodak in 2000 or 2001, the person who was heading their digital imaging division was an extremely bright fellow and very experienced fellow. Asked me casually, what do you think of the idea if we put a camera in a phone? And at that time, no one had actually heard about that. So the idea in itself was a very clever idea, and it wasn't that Kodak was unaware of these developments in the market. It came back to creating the organizational platform from where such ideas could be turned into products with a complete strategy behind it to capture value from these ideas.
As sales of smartphones exceeded even the wildest forecasts of a few years previously, came not just new ways of communicating, but new ways of taking photos.
The phone was what I call the killer app, because to carry a separate camera is fine, and people do that. But once you put it in the phone that you always have with you, and once the image quality gets to be as good as you can get with a digital camera, and you have video, and you have instant sharing, you've got the killer app for imaging right there in that phone.
This has had a profound effect on the digital camera market. Smartphones had replaced dedicated cameras for many, but yet again, Kodak found itself left standing.
Kodak became so focused over time on its own product and its own business model that it lost sight of the wider changes that were taking place in the environment, why people were taking pictures, and what they were doing with that. So Kodak was all about, or Kodak's business model essentially was based on the notion of people taking pictures to preserve memories. People were no longer taking pictures to preserve memories. They were taking pictures to share them.
Everyone can now take photographs on their phone, and they keep those photographs on their computer. They often don't print them. There's no processing model left to be had. They share them immediately via digital technologies.
New billion-dollar firms have sprung up to help us share these snaps. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can share your photo with just one person or the world at the click of a button.
Everything was a Kodak moment now. There was no price or no cost associated with pressing the shutter. With smartphones, suddenly everyone was taking pictures.
For a business like Kodak, this was the death knell. Film isn't dead, of course, but today it's the province of enthusiasts. And where better than Singapore's Chinatown for avid snappers? For photographer Rachel Lim, it provides a rich canvas for her work.
I like the way film gives you lots of surprises. Sometimes, you're shooting stuff, you don't really think that shot's gonna work. And then when you look at your negatives, you go like, oh crap, that looks really nice. I didn't expect that to turn out that way. I love that element of surprise.
But even for someone passionate about film-based photography, she's not immune to the charms of modern technology.
Yeah, I use my smartphone. I use it for a lot of instances, like when I'm in a public place and I want to shoot a sneaky shot and I don't want people to notice me. It's those little moments that I keep spying for. And sometimes when I don't have my film camera with me, I just use my phone. It's quick, you just snap it out. I like instances where people are caught in the middle of doing something, when they are completely absorbed by whatever they're doing. They're lost in their own world.
For Rachel, however handy a smartphone is, nothing beats the qualities of old-fashioned photographic film.
It's all about the way each grain kind of interact with each other. I was really into the colors that Kodak film produced. It was rich, it was vibrant, it's more intensified than the way digital pictures turn out. So I felt quite sad in a way that, oh hey, my teacher said that Kodak's gonna go down and bust, and there I am falling in love with this film. That's not cool.
Rachel is one of the fans, but for most, film was abandoned rapidly in favour of digital snapping. The question remains why and how a company as wealthy and dominant as Kodak could misjudge the photographic world. Why didn't Kodak see this coming? Were its executives asleep at the wheel? Or was this something deeper?
Sure, it's Kodak.
Kodak managed to, over a period of years, demonstrate a warning signals. It's as if there were people running around the boardroom with bells and flashing lights on their heads, and nobody on the board could see it.
It comes down to what Kodak saw from Rochester, New York, or didn't see.
The problem is that all organisations have to look inside to make sure they do what they do as well as they can. They also need to look outside to see what's going on in the market, what competitors are doing and all the rest of it. As organisations become more powerful, more significant in terms of the fact that they are the precursor of that, they stop looking out. And that's when they start believing their own hype. They all say, well, we're number one, therefore we're safe. No, I'm sorry, the message is, if you're number one, the only way is down. And that's what happens.
It wasn't for lack of trying. Kodak spent billions attempting to make up the ground it was losing to competitors. As sales of smartphones rocketed and replaced much of the existing consumer camera market, Kodak was in serious trouble.
Kodak did miss the boat on smartphone technology. Kodak, of course, by that time, it was already in trouble. And as companies fall into trouble and their revenues are shrinking, they begin to panic. And by then, generally, it is too late for them to do anything.
By 2011, gripped by fear, the company embarked on a frenzied fire sale of its valuable intellectual property. A portfolio of patents valued at around $2.5 billion was put on the market. Nearly a year later, those 1,100 patents sold for just $525 million. By January 2012, the beleaguered giant faced the ignominy of a warning from the New York Stock Exchange. Its shares now trailed at under $1. Weeks later, on January the 19th, Kodak bowed to the inevitable and filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The impact on those who loved and worked at Kodak was huge. From 2003 onwards, Kodak closed down 13 plants and cut its workforce by 47,000. And that was before it filed for bankruptcy.
Kodak going into bankruptcy, I think, hurt everybody. And there were a lot of sad stories in that difference. Very sad, very personal stories. And also, anytime you see something that you've loved and you've worked hard at be destroyed, you can't help but feel, one, hurt and also a bit angry at that as well. The sad thing, when I look at it, is from 1983 until 30 years later when it went bankrupt, that's 30 years, the company spent $25 billion in R&D, about $25 billion. and there wasn't one successful hit product in all that time. That's sadder than Kodak going bankrupt or getting acquired.
After losing the battle for digital photography to rival camera makers and then to a new generation of smartphone users, life would never be the same again for the once mighty Kodak. It was down, certainly, but maybe not quite out. Kodak went from being the world's leader in photography to being a broken company in little over a decade. The digital revolution that swept the world destroyed its valuable business of selling photographic film, once worth billions.
Not going digital hurt Kodak's photographic industry in a way that it was never going to recover from and never will recover from. It's impossible to say what's going to happen, but it is, of course, a tiny fraction of the company that it once was. And because it didn't throw all of its energy and weight behind digital imaging.
But the story for Kodak is far from over. It emerged from bankruptcy protection in 2013, albeit chastened and weakened. Today, the old Kodak has evolved into two distinct businesses. Eastman Kodak, which operates in delivering imaging innovations for businesses, and Kodak Alaris.
So Kodak Alaris is a new company. It started 2013. It came from Eastman Kodak. Today we have 3,500 employees across 34 countries. So the company in the last 2 years is growing, especially in Asia region.
Behind the new business are innovations developed at the old Kodak, such as scanning technologies. But perhaps of more value than this is the brand itself, one that continues to resonate.
So the Kodak brand for Kodak Alaris is a very important legacy that we carry from the Kodak. Many customers relate Kodak as a good quality, innovation, and a trust brand.
It's all a far cry from the company's heyday. It was a catastrophic collapse. But could Kodak's bosses have done things differently? Put simply, was Kodak's decline inevitable?
My personal take on companies' lifetime is that the thing that kills companies is their own success, more than anything else, more than the competition.
For some, the fundamentals of business success are not units sold, profit margins and share prices. It's something far simpler and far harder to fix. It's psychology, it's people, it's attitude.
One of the things that is interesting is that people say that Kodak started getting like this when the digital age dawned. That's not actually true, because I think that Kodak started getting complacent even before then. If you look at what was happening maybe late 70s, early 80s in the film business, Kodak was getting to the point that it was complacent about its ability to control the whole global photographic world. For example, Fuji started making significant challenges to what Kodak was doing, and Kodak's responses were effectively to say, oh, well, it's only some Asian small competitor, it's not significant, we're Kodak.
For many years, Japan's Fuji was Kodak's arch rival. Yet, Fuji survived the advent of digital. Indeed, it's prospered. Today, it's valued at around $19 billion US. So how did Fuji thrive while Kodak failed so spectacularly?
There are two different reactions to fear. There's the companies who start being concerned about the eroding of their existing revenue, of the inadequacy of their business model, and they do something about it, and often it's quite drastic. I mean, when we were talking about Fuji, Fuji had to make quite a drastic cut, and they react around this burning platform by saying, all right, we need to change.
One aspect is that Fuji diversified more effectively, moving into areas such as cosmetics and medical technology.
Just as human beings do, and companies are made of human beings. And unless you get a CEO that is radical, and we were talking about Fuji and how the CEO came in and turned towards digital and turned towards cosmetics, did the opposite of his predecessor, which for a Japanese company and in Japanese culture was quite revolutionary and significant.
It also had a far looser corporate structure, which allowed each business to run independently.
Fuji did not follow a strategic process like Kodak and most Western companies did. They followed the Asian way of working on plans. So they would have a 3-year plan or a 5-year plan, which would just be reviewed constantly, continuously. And from that, they would go step by step, and when something didn't work, they would make adjustments. It didn't work, it would make adjustments. So they relentlessly kept moving their businesses to be more successful than they were. And the result is what you see today.
And then, of course, there's Apple, the company that took Kodak's unwanted consumer digital camera and made it a hit.
I think the comparison of Kodak and Apple is an interesting one, because Apple too realized in the early 1990s that it had essentially failed. By the late 1990s, Apple was very close to being bankrupt, because once again it had become focused on its own product, which was computers. When Steve Jobs came back to Apple, Apple changed its name from Apple Computer Company to simply Apple Incorporated.
And what Steve Jobs did was to walk in the door and say, we are no longer a computer platform company. We have lost that battle, so just forget it. We're a consumer company, and I want to stop every single thing that's not aimed at consumers. People were astounded. That focus is what caused Apple to turn around.
They came out with the iPod, and later on they came out with the iPhone. So Apple moved away successfully from its existing business model, and Kodak simply failed to do that.
When Don Strickland took his digital camera to Apple, the company was on its knees. Yet today, Apple is the wealthiest company on Earth. It demonstrates that to survive, you have to adapt.
There are people that say that, organisations have to fail at some point. I don't think that's true, because organisations constantly reinvent themselves if they have the ability so to do, to constantly keep changing how they supply the market. The critical thing is you're accepting that you're existing in a dynamic environment rather than a fixed environment.
The digital revolution was an epoch-making event in technology, and its impact has been far-reaching, altering the very ecosystem companies such as Kodak once thrived in. No business, it seems, can escape its environment. So, are there lessons here from the natural world for Kodak and others of how to cope with altered circumstances? Professor Antonio Monteiro at the National University of Singapore thinks there are some intriguing parallels between business and nature, and perhaps even something to be learnt.
Evolution is constantly happening, but you essentially have to keep evolving in order to keep alive. Organisms try to adapt to their environment, but environments change, and so sometimes populations cannot cope with environmental change. Businesses, I suspect, have the same type of lifespan. They compete with other companies. They try to sell as many products as they can, but eventually they may be overtaken by other businesses and they go extinct as well. So you have to keep evolving in order to actually keep the same and to keep alive.
While Kodak ultimately failed because it couldn't adjust quickly enough to a fast-changing world, the legacy of Kodak endures.
When you shoot it with digital, you have instant gratification, right? With film, there's more thought process. So it really depends on what the photographer is thinking and how he plans his steps. Yes, he only has 36 shots to capture. You work so hard, then you just get one good image. It's very different from digital. Digital photography is like, yeah, man, that's good, that's good, that's good. And then, you just move on and move on and move on. It's like you don't give any appreciation for like a good shot, but this one, it really pulls out the appreciation from you, And then you're like, yeah, this one picture rocks. It looks pretty nice. I wasn't expecting this to turn out this way, because this is one of like my older negatives that I never touched. I wondered how this would turn out actually for some strange reason. When you shoot it on film, it comes with a lot of memories. For example, it's like you shot it at that point of time in that day and how you were feeling and why you were there, who were you with, why do you purposely shot it in this way? And when you're developing it, right, it kind of like rushes back to you. So you feel nostalgic in a way, and I guess maybe that's what sums it up. Patience and nostalgia. I wish it wasn't me. I wish it was someone else that have to watch the fall of Kodak and not my time. No. They are one of the founding people of photography, and we owe a lot of our progress for what we're doing right now, even in digital cameras, because Kodak was part of that stamp line in the history of photography.
Maybe history will judge Kodak's bosses kindly. Few companies have lasted so long and achieved such success. It has left an indelible mark on how we capture special moments.
Kodak, of course, will never be the same again. Kodak was a veritable giant in the field. It shaped how we viewed the world. It shaped our habits in all kinds of different ways. And if it does survive, it'll survive in a more marginal role, and which will be a bit tragic for those of us, who grew up admiring this fascinating company.
Many people relate photographs with particular events they want to remember. And you still see the most photography going on at outings, births, marriages, these events that are very, very important. These kind of perfect moments that one wants to encapsulate. In some way, people are enacting the Kodak moment over and over again. They don't use Kodak anymore to do it, but Kodak survives in that legacy of the notion that what you're doing is freezing that perfect memory.
Based in Shinjuku, Tokyo, Olympus has made a name for itself as a global player in the world of photography. It also diversified into high-tech medical equipment, establishing itself as one of the leading manufacturers of endoscopy equipment. Anne-Valerie Olsen, Professor of Business Strategy, uses Olympus as a case study for her students.
Olympus was always known for high-quality products. It actually started in 1919 in Tokyo making microscopes, and so naturally moved on to medical technology devices. And then with time, it started making lenses because it was making lenses for the microscopes anyway. And from there, it went into the camera business and into digital photography.
In 1936, they introduced their first camera, the Semi-Olympus 1.
People think of Olympus as a camera company, but it's really one of the, it's probably the best medical equipment franchise in the world. I mean, it really is. It's like the Google of the endoscope business.
With Japan's economic boom in the 1970s, Olympus strengthened its production base and expanded it internationally with 3 core products: microscopes, cameras, and medical devices.
Well, you can't take a bad picture, Cheryl.
Neither can you with Olympus OM10.
So Olympus had a very good reputation. In terms of culture, it was very Japanese. But Kikukawa, their CEO, actually applied a Western management style to the company and was lauded for that. He was a very charismatic person, very well liked, and so the company invested heavily in innovation, a lot more than a lot of the other Japanese companies at the time. What we mean when we say Japanese culture is that we refer more to collectivist cultures, as is the case in a lot of Asian countries. So there's a great sense of loyalty towards one's employer. It's cultures that tend to be quite hierarchical, where one does not question authority and where one goes with what the boss says. So very loyal, very strong, bonded cultures.
Kikukawa joined Olympus in 1964 and rose through the ranks to become president in 2001. He was well respected by his peers and was instrumental in pushing Olympus forward in the digital era. And in 2011, he hired their first foreign president and chief operating officer, Michael Woodford. Woodford had already made a name for himself by growing Olympus's international medical business significantly. Kikukawa was confident that he could do likewise at their Tokyo headquarters.
I turned up in the Monolith building at the headquarters of Olympus in Shinjuku, and I was taken in to see Kikukawa. He was a very charming man. He talked to me about, my family, and he knew them all by name. And then he said he'd been running the company for 10 years. He didn't think he'd changed it enough and felt, I could do what was necessary, and would I take the job? And we didn't discuss terms or anything. I just said yes.
In his 30 years at Olympus, Woodford's impact quickly earned him a position heading the company's European business. There, he successfully overhauled the European operations and made it profitable. Kikukawa was impressed with his accomplishments and trusted him.
Kikukawa and the rest of the board were very happy to appoint him, said that Woodford had exceeded all expectations and that he would make a great CEO. And this is CEO of the medical technology devices, so medical devices not of all of Olympus. It was global head.
Hiring a foreigner as president and COO is unusual in the Japanese corporate environment. In most businesses, the practice is to hire employees fresh out of university who then work their way up the ladder.
And of course, it takes a long time to become a board member of a company. If we look back 30, 40 years ago, basically no foreigners were hired by Japanese companies, right?
But from the start, there were signs that the new appointment might not be all that it seemed. Woodford soon realized that he did not have the power to make fundamental decisions, as Kikukawa created the position of CEO for himself.
When I was offered the job and became president, that's what I thought I was becoming. But Kikukawa-san had other ideas. The president formally would have been the CEO, but he made himself chairman and CEO, which I came to realize meant that he controlled the board. I quickly saw that he controlled all the levers, and the board were literally puppets, and he was the puppet master. There was no ifs or buts. It's whatever Kikukawa said was the course to be followed.
In 2011, less than 4 months after being appointed president, Woodford stumbled on a long-buried secret about Olympus, made public in a local magazine.
I was in Hamburg chairing the European board meeting, and in a break I received an email from a friend of mine. He said, "Michael, you need to know this magazine, Factor, has made these extraordinary revelations about Olympus."
It had this article suggesting that some of the acquisitions that Olympus made there was something wrong with them. They'd paid too much money to people whose identities could not be really ascertained. So what was the purpose of these deals, was what it was asking.
Woodford contacted his close friend Waku Miller, his translator for corporate relations with the Japanese media, and showed him the shocking allegations.
To be perfectly honest with you, and this is something that I will be ashamed of to the grave, the tone of the magazine is very forceful, it's very sensational, and the tone put me off. I mean, the tone of the article made me not want to believe it. I should have put up a bigger red flag for me than it did. Micah was very concerned about the amount of debt that they had incurred, and I should have paid more attention to that.
Woodford was eager to get to the bottom of the controversial charges, and the only way was to speak directly to his boss, Kikukawa.
And I phoned my secretary, Michiko, and said, "Michiko, can I see Kikukawa, please? It's very important." And then Michiko phones back and says, "Michael, flat as a pancake. Kikukawa-san is very, very busy today, secretary tells me. But as you're so insistent," and adds emphasis to the word insistent, "he will see you today at lunchtime."
This was the first time that Woodford realized the limits on his authority. inside Olympus. When he started asking questions and he was getting stonewalled, it was a real shock for him to realize that, he was shackled in this way.
Woodford was able to get Kikukawa and Vice President Hisashi Mori to meet him in person.
I can remember that lunch meeting, the first time I was to challenge and confront Kikukawa vividly, like it was yesterday. And I walked in and there was a large boardroom table, and right in the center was Kikukawa-san, the chairman, and Mori-san, who in effect managed all the financial transactions of the company.
Kikukawa and Mori sat dead center of a long table.
Where I was to sit was a tuna sandwich. And if you're not Japanese, you may not understand the significance. I mean, everyone knew I loved sushi. But this tuna sandwich, it was still wrapped up. In Japan, you would never leave the cling film on it. There was no salad or crisps around it. It was just you just would never do that in Japan. And I understood, and I was thrown that, it disorientated me that the message for me, and many of the messages in Japan, is non-verbal communication. Kikukawa was the luxury sushi platter at Olympus, and I was the manky tuna sandwich, and I shouldn't forget it.
For Woodford, the message was clear. Without uttering a single word, Kikukawa had made it clear that, as a foreigner, Woodford had no business interfering in Olympus's most sensitive affairs.
And smiling away, and he said, Michael, you're too busy to worry about these domestic issues.
As the president of Olympus, Woodford knew it was his responsibility to sign off the accounts and answer to the company auditors.
So I said, I know that you are very busy today. Can I suggest that I talk with Mori-san alone? And he didn't like it. And he sort of huffed and gruffed and left the room, and I was then alone with Mori.
As vice president at Olympus, Mori reported directly to Woodford, who expected transparency and honesty from his staff. Woodford was disappointed that Mori had withheld the Factor article from him and pressed him further on the allegations of 3 terrible acquisitions, including a face cream and microwave company, as well as paying $687 million in advisory fees to an unknown company in the Cayman Islands.
And he just ignored my questions, and it was one of the most disorientating things I've ever had in my life. I started, to get tense with him. And I said, we've bought a company which makes microwave dishes. I mean, we're a healthcare company, Mori-san.
It was obvious there was something very wrong.
So not only were they paying a lot of money for companies that weren't making a lot of money, simply put, but on top of it, they were paying consulting fees for advice that was no way worth that amount of money.
And I got angry, and I got up, and I walked around the table and came very close to him. And I asked him, I said, Mori-san, who do you work for? Who do you work for? As long as I live, I'll never forget Mori's response to that question. And he pointed. And he said to me, I work for Kikukawa-san! I'm loyal to Kikukawa-san!
In 2011, English businessman Michael Woodford, who'd been brought in to modernize Japanese electronics giant Olympus, was being increasingly isolated from company chairman Kikukawa and other senior managers at Olympus. He'd found evidence of serious corporate wrongdoing. Now he had to make a tough decision. Do you continue demanding answers, or do you quietly fall into line? Woodford's mother instilled in him a strong sense of right and wrong when he was still a little boy.
I remember I went to buy some chocolate, and I took some money from her purse, and I thought she wouldn't notice. And when I came back, she was waiting for me, and she had quite a temper. And I thought I was gonna, I was really gonna be in for it. But all she said to me was, you've stolen money from one of your family. What does that say about you? If I can't trust my own son. And, that was seared on my consciousness about, stealing. And even if you could get away from it, what does it say about you?
Praveen Nair is a business psychologist with almost 2 decades of experience.
What tends to drive a whistleblower to speak out would be where they fall within this continuum of justice and loyalty. So if we were to do it like a straight line, and justice being over here and loyalty being over here, the closer they are to the justice aspect would probably make them more likely to speak out.
Woodford's connection to Olympus began with him working for one of their contractors, KeyMed, in 1981, where he ran a tight ship. This was when he first met Waku Miller.
My firm was producing a Japanese language magazine for the British Embassy. One of our stops was the company KeyMed in Southend. And Michael was the president of KeyMed at the time we visited. My first experience with Michael was having them check the reverse English translation of the draft that we'd written about the company. And it was a tremendously trying experience. He was just absolutely obsessive about perfection.
Woodford went on to head Olympus's entire European business.
Michael Woodford was very successful in Europe, and he managed to restructure the European organization in a very solid way. He was also very well known for his compliance issues and regulations. He strikes me as a real goal-getter. Very intelligent, very smart, business smart, but also very well versed to lead a team towards success as a company, towards a financial solid company. And I think that Kikukawa at that moment was very appreciative of that and brought him into Tokyo.
As head of Olympus Europe, Woodford made the region the biggest contributor to the company's profits. It was then that President Kikukawa offered him the presidency.
Michael Woodford spent almost his entire career at Olympus. So he's always had this reputation of being somebody that was very honest, very ethical, and would go out of his way to call on people if they weren't being honest and ethical. He started off initially at Cadbury Schweppes. Before that, he was an intern in a small aerospace company, and there he already had the reputation of a whistleblower. So at the time, he had denounced, I guess is the word, a secretary that had used office stamps to send her holiday post. And he had been asked to leave because of that, and then it had proven to be true.
As Woodford probed deeper and demanded answers of the dubious acquisitions, his relationship with Kikukawa and Mori worsened.
After the showdown over the sushi platter, the relationship between myself, Kikukawa, and Mori deteriorated, but we went through the motion.
The allegations against Olympus had been published by Factor less than a month ago, and Woodford needed to find a way out of the Tokyo office that could allow him to probe further.
I could feel the contempt oozing from them. I've never felt such loathing in my life. I went to Kikukawa and said to him, I think I should visit our factories which lie outside of Japan, and in the Czech Republic, in Germany, in Britain, in America. And he snapped at it. He wanted me out of the Tokyo office as much as I wanted to be out of there. And that was the longest business trip I ever went on. And it ended in September in New York.
By this time, the pressure of the unlawful allegations was beginning to take its toll.
I was drinking a lot by then, just to try and sedate myself. We went to a steak restaurant, and I got back, and it was around 11:30 at night. And I remember going into the bathroom and looking in the mirror, and I was 5 kilos less than I am now, and dark, you know, inset eyes. But it wasn't my physical condition which was troubling me. I knew my mental well-being, my mental health was deteriorating because, you know, I knew there was this sickness, this problem, but I wasn't sure of what to do. You know, how do I deal with it? You know, the shareholders don't seem interested, the financial institutions, the media. No one seems to, you know, is it me who's mad?
He also realized the board was not aligned with him and wouldn't allow any more investigation into the allegations around these fraudulent or dubious acquisitions.
Woodford was having sleepless nights and was becoming dependent on sleeping pills.
And I remember I had a brown plastic Perspex bottle of sleeping tablets. And I looked on the back and it said, don't mix with alcohol. And I know that's not a good idea, but I thought a worse idea was not to sleep, so I took 2 of them. Went to sleep almost immediately.
If you've worked in a company for around 30 years, you'd feel very close affinity to that company. And to have that company suddenly do something that you're not familiar with or against your personal beliefs, that's almost akin to having a family member go against you. So that would definitely create feelings of tension that could have manifested in mood swings, it could have manifested in sleeplessness, it could have manifested in not being able to sustain positive relationships in your life.
When you're traveling particularly, you become even more addictive, you know, to opening up your emails to see if there's a message maybe your children have written to you.
But awaiting Woodford in his inbox was worse news. The same business magazine had published a follow-up article containing more allegations against Olympus, alleging possible links to organized crime.
But what shocked me, it said that these transactions were linked to anti-social forces, a euphemism for the mafia, the Yakuza. But the idea that there could be people with tattoos and missing finger digits who might want to hurt me, or worse still, hurt my wife, or even worse, hurt my children. You know, I was a businessman. You know, I sent out mission statements, answered emails, and visited factories. I had no knowledge of how to cope with organized crime.
Whistleblowing is not something that is going to be easy for anyone. And normally, whether or not someone whistleblows will depend a lot on their personal characteristics. In Michael Woodford's case, perhaps what was going on is what we term dissonance, cognitive dissonance. And that is basically when an individual holds 2 contrasting beliefs at the same time, and it creates a lot of tension, discomfort, a lot of mental pressures.
Despite the growing psychological pressure, Woodford continued to press for answers. Having already tried to raise his concerns in meetings and being rebuffed with tuna sandwiches, the revelations in this Second Factor article encouraged Woodford to put his concerns in writing. Over the next 6 weeks, Woodford wrote a series of official emails challenging Kikukawa and the Olympus board.
Kikukawa actually wrote to me and said, Michael, it's not helpful you asking all these questions. I'm sure it wasn't helpful. I copied them to all the board members.
Yet in October 2011, Kikukawa appointed Woodford CEO as well as president. But what may have seemed to be a positive change was actually hardly publicized in Japan.
I think what's interesting and one intriguing anecdote is the fact that when Woodford was appointed CEO, so even after he was promoted from CEO to CEO position, his promotion was only written up in the English language website and not on the Japanese website.
But in actual fact, when I became CEO, he had blind, utter loyalty from all the other board members who were all Japanese males in the latter stages of their career. Complete blind loyalty.
But the promotion didn't stop Woodford from continuing to ask difficult questions. He wrote his final email to the board, this time copying in an outside auditing firm.
The last letter I wrote in the UK, and I included a report from PwC, an independent auditor, one of the big four, which confirmed the concerns I had. Now, for the other directors, 1.7 billion US dollars had been spent on these 3 Mickey Mouse companies, and from this consultancy, from a company which went under the name of Axim or ASIS. Even if those people were the devil personified, for their own self-interest, the president is asking to bring in forensic accountants.
Within the same email, Woodford explicitly asked for the resignation of Kikukawa as well as Mori.
And I pressed it. You watch the thing, email send. And then I watched to see, because I asked for reply receipts, and half an hour later I saw that a Japanese director working in the United States responded and had read it. And then obviously he had phoned and woken everyone up in Tokyo, and they all started to come in.
Woodford was summoned to an extraordinary board meeting back in Tokyo.
I walk into the boardroom at a few minutes before 9. This, long board table again. But the board meeting has a lot of pomp and ceremony, and there's all these people on a second group of chairs behind in tables, translators and note takers and advisors and all sorts of people. And when I walk in, it was noisy, much more noisy, and it reminded me of one of those wildlife programs with hyenas. It had that feel of hysteria in the room. I was sitting there feeling very uncomfortable, noting that nobody will look at me, this non-verbal communication. And a few minutes past 9, and I start to look at my watch in an exaggerated manner, because meetings never start late.
This was the meeting that would change the fates of Olympus and Woodford forever. English businessman Michael Woodford had taken an extraordinary business decision, demanding the resignation of the top man at Olympus, the same man who had given him his job. The board immediately called an emergency meeting. Almost 15 minutes later, Kikukawa turned up.
And Kikukawa didn't come to his seat at the top of the table. He went to the podium in the far corner of the room. So he got this tatty piece of paper out of his pocket and said, today's meeting's to discuss serious concerns about Olympus. And he said, that has been cancelled, that agenda. And the new agenda is the dismissal of Michael Woodford as president, representative director, and CEO. And on the last syllable, all the people around the table put their hands up, supporting the motion that I'm dismissed. I wanted to speak at the board meeting. I had a document I had prepared the night before of questions I wanted to ask, but I was told that I wasn't allowed to speak.
Less than 8 months after being named president of the Japanese electronics brand, and barely a fortnight after becoming CEO, Michael Woodford was left with no choice but to pack his belongings and leave the building. But just as he was leaving, another senior Olympus executive entered his office.
And he's a big guy, as big as me, and he came up to me and he called me by my first name, Michael. Now, I don't mind what people call me, but he didn't normally. It was Woodford-san, or president in Japanese. But again, it was a way of asserting. And he said to me, give me your computers. And I said, I can't because they've already gone back to the UK securely. He got very angry and then demanded my mobile phones. And I had a Samsung, which I gave him. And I smiled at him and said, I've wiped it. And then I had my Apple iPhone, and I said, again, I got angry and said, my wife is going to be worried, Who are you? Are you a policeman? Are you going to take it off me? I'm not going to give it you.
Woodford's translator, an American who now calls himself Waku Miller, had worked closely with him and was handling his corporate relations with the Japanese media. He was one of the first to find out about the sacking.
They fire Michael because even though he's been in the organization for 30 years, they've discovered to their great surprise that this person is in fact unilateral and arbitrary in his management style, and that he's simply not suited to a Japanese organization. He was going to get to the bottom of what had happened at this company, and Olympus's management did not want that to happen.
Woodford left the Olympus office and headed back to his apartment in Tokyo. At the reception area, he noticed several heavily muscled men.
Who are these people? And that just fed my fear. And I'm very particular about the way I pack because I travel a lot. But I just threw everything into this case and was out of the 8 or 9 minutes, and they were still there in the library downstairs. I was sweating profusely. I was starting to tremble. I phoned Jonathan Sobel from there, who was the Financial Times correspondent in Japan. And I said, Jonathan, there's so much more to this, can we meet? And he said, there's a small cafe across the road. And we met in there 10 minutes later.
My first question was, are you okay? What happened? He said there's hundreds of millions of dollars missing. And it became clear that he was worried that he was in danger, that people might be following him or worse. A lot of money had left Olympus. A lot of money had been taken out of this company in mysterious and suspicious ways. He explained what he thought was happening inside Olympus. He presented me with a binder full of evidence to back up his case. And then he went to the airport. He took a suitcase and said, I want to get on the first plane that I can. I don't feel safe. And I spent the next few hours going through his evidence. Of course, I contacted Olympus to get a comment from them. Talked over it with editors and lawyers. And the thing he said to me before he left was, can I trust you to carry this story through? And then 10 hours later, he got off that plane, a plane in Heathrow, and his wife was there with a copy of the FT that she bought at the airport, I think, with his story on the front page.
Back in the UK, Woodford was determined to hold Kikukawa and his board accountable. He did as many interviews with the international press as possible, making sure that the scandal went global.
All of them have to go. All of them have to go. If they don't, then that means there's a tolerance of either incompetence or much, much worse.
As well as continuing to talk to the media, he started planning his next direct move against Olympus.
We're making progress.
I'd put together a new board of all Japanese senior figures, but the institutional shareholders, it became clear they wouldn't speak out, they wouldn't criticize Olympus. This is the 3 mega banks and the insurance company. Whilst I'd hoped I could get Olympus back on, the right path, I knew it was beyond my abilities to change Japan. Corporate Japan needed to change. And, I couldn't do that.
Olympus stuck to their story. Their official stance? Woodford did not understand Japanese business practices. A new president was brought in for damage control.
っていうことになりますと、これは医療のこの条件の中ではですね、適切だったというふうに私は考えています。ウドフォード氏は本来取締役でありながら社内の機密情報を全部開示してしまったわけですよね。 でこのことについて我々としてはですね、大変な憤りを感じているわけであります。
I think that they were just desperately hoping they could get away with it, that they could contain it, that they could discredit him. The whole way along, they underestimated how much was going to come out no matter what they said. They would admit only the bare minimum.
That people are basically with one company for all their career, and I think this sort of dominates a lot of the things that we see in the Japanese company. Because often what is called loyalty might also be dependence. Someone for his career, for his well-being.
And I've heard the Japanese media described by many as sycophantic, that they bow down to the big Japanese corporations and don't want to rock the boat and ask the difficult questions. And definitely from the outside, looking at how they behaved, as a former journalist myself, that's exactly what they were doing in this case.
While the Japanese media shied away from the story, the international media latched onto it. The sheer scale of the fraud meant that the fallout was going to get bigger. Mark Worthington is an expert on how to manage business scandals. After a decade as correspondent for BBC News, he currently oversees crisis communication strategies for several multinational corporations.
Well, the fact that the company was still denying, even when the international media were writing openly about the allegations and referring to the CEO as being the one who was making them, is quite extraordinary. It's hard to see how that could happen anywhere else other than Japan. It seemed a pretty indefensible position, and yet the denials were still coming. And a motivating factor for that can only be the kind of corporate loyalty and that culture that you find in Japan. That was hugely damaging to their reputation. In a situation like this, when a company like Olympus faces these kinds of challenges, the worst thing you can possibly do is be seen to be denying, lying, covering up.
By November 2011, Olympus finally admitted to hiding massive losses. The company revealed that they'd made dubious acquisitions to cover up bad investments since before 1990. It had taken 20 years for their wrongdoings to come to light. Kikukawa resigned 2 weeks prior to the admissions, and Mori was dismissed for his role in the fraud. But this was only the beginning of a massive shake-up within the Olympus board.
In December, retired Supreme Court Judge Kanaka reported, and this a huge report, and described Olympus as a board of yes men, and vindicated the action I'd taken, which then led really to the whole board having to step down at the extraordinary general meeting the following April.
Today at those meetings, for the first time, I had a sense of relief comparable to when Jonathan published, is that this story will be different.
The Tokyo District Court ruled that dismissed President Tsuyoshi Kikukawa and 5 other members of the board had to pay more than $500 million to Olympus. But the damage had already been done. Olympus shares, which remained steady since the scandal broke out, suddenly plummeted by almost 70% in less than a month.
The impact of this scandal on Olympus reputationally, in terms of its finances, in terms of its staff, were colossal and cannot be underestimated. If we start on a reputational level, they became almost the poster child for corporate fraud, corporate failure, corporate cover-up, and their name became synonymous with those things.
The Olympus case raised wider questions on how corporations were managed. Japanese financial regulators had long tolerated a common business practice of hiding losses, known in Japan as tobashi.
What happened is that in the 80s, many companies had some problems growing their main markets any longer, especially after the evaluation of the yen, and the yen increased in value, and maybe some of their overseas markets broke away. Japanese companies looked for other ways to increase their revenues.
Many of these companies made disastrous investments that ended up in massive losses. And when the Japanese bubble finally burst, most of the corporations didn't know how to cover their tracks.
The Tobashi was a way to hide those losses in some affiliated companies, maybe with some other companies, so that the losses would not appear in the books of the main and in the statements, balance statements of the main company any longer. But eventually they had to pay up for that. And I think this is then when companies got into problems, finding ways to make up for those losses.
The Tobashi scheme was banned in early 2000s, but there are still Japanese corporations that continue with it behind closed doors. In 2015, Toshiba president Hiesao Tanaka was forced to step down at the electronics and computer giant when a similar scandal came to light.
Since the Olympus scandal, there's been a new corporate governance code put in place that recommends things like putting independent directors on the boards of every company, that kind of thing, which had not been common in Japan before that. This effort was underway before the Olympus scandal, but the Olympus scandal, I think, definitely gave it a kind of tailwind that helped convince some skeptics that it was worthwhile to try and repair the reputation for Japanese financial markets and companies.
For a lot of people, there was no sense to leave the company immediately, because the fundamentals of the company and the structure that was in the various regions and in the various organizations was good.
But change was still needed at the top. A new board took over the reins from Kikukawa and set out to restructure the company.
They wanted to go back into the core business of medical clinical division, microscopy products, and the camera products.
They also took a number of steps in terms of corporate governance, reporting, making sure they had external auditors that were really independent and not linked to the board in any way.
The scandal was reminiscent of the collapse of American gas and energy giant Enron some 10 years before. This led to a commitment to the comprehensive reform of business practices, setting new compliance standards for corporate management.
The Olympus case did for Japan what Enron did for the US. So every time you have a scandal, policymakers, shareholders, boards will question the way business was always done and whether it should be done this way. And just like it changed, Enron changed the governance policies and the board liabilities and so on in the US. Olympus did the same thing for Japanese businesses.
When we look at Olympus today, it is hugely different to the Olympus at the time the scandal took place. And the fact that trust had been completely destroyed left them with no choice but to completely rebuild, and to rebuild very openly. So we saw the new management talk about total transparency.
In 2012, Olympus released a report to reassure their investors. Led by new president Hiroyuki Sasa from their medical equipment marketing division, and former banker Yasuyuki Kimoto as their new chairman, the board promised to win back public trust and to prevent another scandal from occurring.
They comprehensively overhauled the way that the company was structured, the way that it communicated, the way that it was governed, making sure that checks and balances were in place, but also demonstrating openly to investors and the outside world what was happening. Because in a situation like the one Olympus faced, when you are that broken and your reputation is that low, you're not going to be able to communicate your way out of that situation. You have to demonstrate what you're doing.
A new set of protocols was put in place to regain the public's trust. And it started with the most basic, regulations and signatories.
The way Olympus was recovering and gained the trust back from the public and from their customers was to put regulations in place, regulations on signatories. People, for certain amounts, a certain level of signatures were required, and always in twofold. Others were regulations that all the staff had to sign forms that they will not conduct any wrongdoings with money like briberies or even sponsorships, etc. So everything was very much scrutinized. So once the company was restructured, or the board of the company was restructured, everything recovered quite easily, because the local structures of the organizations were very solid and very good.
Despite the scandal, the public perception of Olympus as a manufacturer of high-tech cameras hasn't faded. And the tech team is still creating new products that keep the brand relevant. Lance Ong is a camera fan who swears by the Olympus equipment range. He's been using their cameras since 2002 and vouches for their quality, which has vastly improved despite the internal mismanagement.
2012, they are the first one who introduced the 5-axis image stabilization, which is the first in the world. And also that is the game changer for the whole mirrorless system, where all other brands start to jump into mirrorless system where to compete with Olympus.
Mirrorless cameras drastically reduce the size of previously bulky DSLR systems without sacrificing image quality. A camera setup is now a fraction of what it used to cost, making photography much more affordable to both professionals as well as enthusiasts.
The greatest advantage for Olympus to go into Micro Four Third, where they make the camera smaller, yet you can still have a digital SLR image quality. This changed the whole ball game, where they become the leading brand of mirrorless. And till today, they are still one of the leading brands for camera system or mirrorless camera system.
Since the fraud, Michael Woodford has published a book, Exposure Inside the Olympus Scandal, detailing his role as a whistleblower in the indictment of the former Olympus board. These days, Woodford works as a consultant for many large companies, advising them on how to prevent the same thing from happening to their corporations.
Signs that Olympus has come out of the crisis are now all around us. Their name is no longer a name that is associated with the misdeeds of the past. Probably the first indicator to the outside world is the share price, when the confidence starts to return. And that's the market looking at the steps that have been taken, reading in depth the documents that are setting out the new corporate governance policies, the philosophies of the new leadership.
So 6 years on, they still have a big share of the market in endoscopy and microscopy, and they're doing very well with their camera business. So they were able to turn around and they're doing well again. So back from the brink.
Photographs. Globally, we take more than 20,000 of them every second. The equipment may have changed a bit over the years, but our love of photography has only intensified. It's a way to document and preserve our memories, and for decades, Fujifilm and their trademark green boxes dominated the Japanese photography market.
Fuji's advanced technology has developed the fastest, most light-sensitive color print film in the world.
But times change. The turn of the millennium ushered in a digital era. A technological revolution swept across the globe, altering everything it touched. No longer was photo film a vital part of photographs. The very foundation of Fujifilm vanished in an instant. To survive, Fujifilm would have to boldly venture into uncharted territory, rethinking and reapplying everything they had built their empire on. To find out how they did it, we've been given rare access to the inner workings of the company and to the people who inspired the recovery. Situated in the heart of Tokyo, Fujifilm's headquarters is that of a sleek, modern company. Yet, occupying pride of place on the ground floor is an exhibition, not on the company's future, but on its history. And Fujifilm's current CEO has a lot to do with this.
写真の文化というのはさっきも言ったように、私は人間にとってなくてはならない文化の一つだと思うんです。やっぱりね、人生の真実、 あるいは人生の現実、それをね、その瞬間を記録できる。記録するだけじゃなくて形で残る、プリントにすれば。そうすると子供の時のあの楽しい思い出なんかも蘇ってくる。やっぱり大事な文化だと思うんです。で、そのために我々はメーカーとしてこの写真文化を守りますと。
Fujifilm's perceived role as custodians of photography is not only something that Shigetaka Komori holds close to his heart, but it's a principle that the company have staked their reputation on since their inception in 1934. Yuzo Toda, now Komori's right-hand man, joined the company over 40 years ago, and his first day at work is still very vivid.
その人が一番最初に僕らに聞いた言葉が今でも鮮明に覚えてまして、でそれが僕のずっとこの富士フイルムライフにおけるね羅針盤です。君たち富士フイルムの製品は何だか知ってるかっていう質問でした。でもちろんあの時代フィルムが一番メイン商品でカメラももちろん商品ありましたけど、そんな単純な質問を聞いているんではないというのは誰でも分かりましたけど、答えは誰にも分からない。その時彼がですね、大きな字でですね、黒板に「信頼」って書いたんです。Trust。これが富士フイルムの商品だと。
It is this ethos that laid the foundations of the company in the 1940s. They chose to locate their first factory at the foot of Mount Fuji because the clean air and fresh water made for the best quality photo film. And the iconic Japanese mountain also gave the company its first name, Fuji Photo Film. First specializing in motion picture tape, Fujifilm only began producing film for the amateur consumer market in the 1950s. And from that point on, Fujifilm's history was characterized by competition with a much larger company, the great American photo giant, Kodak.
まさに先生であり、我々が追い求める理想とでも言いましょうかね。そういう存在でしたね。古い技術ですけど、あの写真をですね、産業にまで育て上げた、まあそのアメリカの一つの。
And not just any business. Kodak had turned photography into a $10 billion juggernaut. On average, they sold more film in 6 weeks than Fujifilm sold in an entire year.
I believe that rivalry was a major driving force inside Fuji. They were always seeing themselves as trying to compete, trying to catch up with Kodak. Fuji was leading company in Japan and in parts of Asia, but in the US, you know, Kodak had 90% market share.
The moments of your life are priceless. Are you saving them on the right film?
The company's iconic Kodak Moment ads sold people not merely photo film, but the opportunity to capture life's memories. And throughout the 80s, Kodak seemed to have a monopoly on memories. Fujifilm had to find another way to compete.
Kodak had a massive brand name, and it was very, very difficult to sort of outcompete Kodak on brand reputation or on sort of people's image of the company. It was much easier to sort of establish a good quality, eventually even comparable, if not better quality, and compete on slightly lower price.
Here comes Fujifilm with color pictures so true to life. It's a real breakthrough.
Unable to compete with the Kodak brand, Fujifilm focused on beating them with superior technology. In 1976, they released their groundbreaking high-speed 400 film, enabling users to capture the world in unprecedented detail and color.
Get extraordinary Fuji high-resolution films and get the true picture.
カラーフィルムという商品はですね、まさにサイエンスの塊であるということですね。それからその非常に複雑なものづくり。
The chemical knowledge, the expertise required to produce film is considerable. It's not easy. It took, if you consider Fuji's history from 1930s, it took 40 years before they caught up with the market leaders. And that 40 years is not easily replicable by a new entrant.
Through decades of experience, Fujifilm scientists have mastered an incredibly technical feat. Each negative contains over 100 light-sensitive chemicals, finely balanced to accurately capture your image. The underdogs had finally matched Kodak.
忘れられないのは、やっぱり製造現場のマニュファクチャリングをしている現場のオペレーションに携わっている人たちの誇りですね。自分たちはやっぱり世界一のものを作ってるんだ。
Despite boasting a superior product, Fujifilm still lagged far behind Kodak in terms of market share. But in 1984, this was all about to change.
Welcome to the opening ceremonies of the Games of the 23rd Olympiad at Los Angeles.
The big shift was the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles, when Kodak was sort of at the peak of its powers and rather complacent, and they turned down the offer from the Olympic organizers to become a sponsor, and Fuji immediately jumped at the opportunity.
When the Olympic Games open next summer, a dazzling new performer will be there. Fujicolor HR, official film of the Los Angeles 1984 Olympics.
Fujifilm attacked Kodak in the heart of its consumer base, and it paid off massively.
In sport and film, Fuji takes the gold with Fujicolor HR, the color film champion.
As the knowledge spread of them becoming the Olympic sponsor, they said that their calls from distributors started immediately getting returned. They got 50,000 distributors very fast. And so the distribution network grew dramatically. Their reputation, their position in the market grew dramatically, effectively overnight.
But just as Fujifilm and Kodak were embroiled in a marketing war, a bigger threat was looming.
Throughout human existence, we've always had change. But what's happening is the change is getting faster. 20 years ago, 25 years ago, people had mobile phones that were the size of small briefcases and weighed a ton. So within the fastest moving technologies, it is moving at a frightening pace, and we see that all around us.
The digital photography revolution was coming. It would disrupt the industry in the same way CDs replaced records or email replaced the handwritten letter. Relying on photo film for 70% of their profits, Fujifilm was firmly in the crosshairs.
It doesn't matter how big your organization is, how long it's been founded, unless you are in a total monopoly position and no one can get into your market, you are going to be subject to market pressures. You just have to make sure that you change and update as fast as the market you're in.
Both Fujifilm and Kodak knew the digital age was coming. The question was, how would these film companies survive it?
その大変な時があったんです。うちは2003年4年、それからずっとそれからリーマンショックもあったし、こういうところでね、やっぱりその主力産業がなくなって一番最初のその21世紀の初めの写真がどんどん減っていった時、アナログがデジタルに移っていった時の戦略がね、圧倒的な分量でバーっていっぺんでやらなきゃダメだと分かってるけど、まあそれぞれのその事業の仕込みの中でそれがどれだけ進歩できるか進化できるかね。
Excuse me, Santa? Would you mind moving a little more into the light?
This'll help. Now there's a film designed to enhance your camera's performance in virtually...
Over decades, Fujifilm had pushed the boundaries of photo film, making it one of the dominant forces in photography. But everything was about to change. The digital world was fast approaching. Yet in the late 1980s, Fujifilm appeared to be ahead of the curve. Not yet impacting the everyday consumer, the first wave of digitalization was felt in business-to-business markets. And Fujifilm was providing cutting-edge digital X-ray to hospitals.
そういう意味ですごい危機感はあったんだけども、逆にその危機感をバネにある程度スムーズに変身できた理由が、なぜ変身できたんですかって聞かれたら、実は B2B の分野でいろいろデジタルには慣れ親しんでいました。
And inside Fujifilm labs, plans were already in place for a fully digital camera. Despite building a business empire on film, they were about to create a film-less camera.
で我々はですね、そのデジタルの技術が出てきた時に、それをですね拒否するのではなく、それはやっぱり自分でもやろうと思った。自分で積極的にやろうと。それはカニバリズムです。自分のアナログを食うことにもなる。でもね、うちがやらなくても誰かがやる。他がやる。ならばその私どももデジタルに入っていってプレイヤーになろうやないか。
In 1988, Fujifilm released the world's first fully digital camera, the Fujix DS-1P. On this memory card, it could store between 5 and 10 photographs, and it boasted a 1.1 megapixel resolution. The camera was available to professionals for several thousand US dollars.
一般のアマチュアはとても買える値段じゃないんで、例えば雑誌社とか新聞社とかそういうところが業務用になったんですよ。
Releasing more digital camera models, Fujifilm displayed a remarkable willingness for creative destruction. A willingness its great rival Kodak did not appear to share.
うちはデジタルカメラもやってました。コダックも後で追っかけてきましたけども、本格的じゃなかった。で、そこが一つ大きなポイント差だったと思う。
But as Fujifilm were facing the dawn of the digital age head-on, it didn't arrive. Digital cameras remained the preserve of professionals, and incredibly, the photo film market continued to grow.
Fuji invested heavily in digital technology in the 1980s, and the transition seemed to stall for like a decade, possibly longer than anyone expected. The film photography business was still very profitable, and the sales peak was in roughly 2000, 2001, so it had been consistently growing until then.
Distracted by the resurgence of the film market, Fujifilm abandoned its new business ventures. And despite pioneering the digital camera over a decade earlier, by 2001, 2/3 of the company's profits still came from photo film. After all, if it ain't broke, why fix it?
それまではなかなか普及しなかったデジタルカメラ、先ほどから言ってる値段の問題とか、それから解像力の問題があって、一般の写真なかなか追いつかないねということだったんだけど。
Within Fujifilm, there was a sense that the printed picture, as it had been for decades, would survive. Driven by this belief, they poured millions of dollars into the development and marketing of Instax Mini. A 100% analog camera, its main selling point, you could take a photo and print it in seconds. And who could blame them? In 2002, the camera was selling over 1 million units a year.
併存できるんじゃないかと思いました。というのはデジタルで撮ってもね、これフィルムはいりませんが、デジタルカメラで撮った場合フィルムはいらないけれども、写真というのはやっぱプリントするっていうんです。プリントするものなんです。
But they were wrong. In 2003, the long-awaited digital age became a reality. Sales of photo film plummeted, dropping by 1/3 in less than a year. And later, sales of the Instax Mini, a dependable source of profit, crashed to 10% of their peak. Why bother to print every photo when digital cameras enabled you to view and discard them on an inbuilt digital screen?
でカラーフィルムもそんなに簡単に減らないと思ってた最初は。でもあっという間にね、デジタルカメラに移っていったんですね。
Over the next months, the fall in demand for film was catastrophic.
もっと急激にフィルムが減り始めて、デジタリゼーションが始まったわけです。急激な。で年間 25% とか 30% ぐらいの需要でドーンと落ちていった。カラーフィルムの需要が。でデジタルカメラになっていった。
In a matter of 6 months, shops went from processing almost 5,000 rolls of film per day to less than 1,000. A market that had accounted for 2/3 of Fujifilm's profits had disappeared in the blink of an eye. It was at this point that Komori was appointed CEO of Fujifilm. His task to save the company was immense.
まあその時はやはりもういろいろアナログカラーフィルムやなんかのアナログの需要予測したんですがね、もうこれ会社が持たないと思ったね。だからもうそれはなって、でその先10年7年8年10年このぐらいどうなるかって言ったらもうほとんどもうないだろう。でこれ大変なことだと、でどうするかというふうなことがまあ分かったんですね。
At their lowest point, Fujifilm had called on one of their longest-serving employees. Komori joined the company in 1963. Promotion after promotion, he worked his way up from project manager to president and CEO. And to this day, Fujifilm is the only company he's worked for. Now its future was in his hands.
まあ企業というのはある程度の売り上げを確保しないといけない。でやはり2兆円か3兆円ぐらいの売り上げはそういう会社で存続するにはこの会社をどう仕立て直さなきゃいけないかというのが私に与えられた CEO としての課題だったわけです。その問題をどう解くか。
In 2004, Fujifilm's net profits from imaging fell by nearly $85 million, and the world was about to change once more. Another disruptive technology would completely rewrite the rules of photography: mobile phones.
Mobile phones have completely revolutionized digital photography. They have so many advantages over carrying a camera. You have your mobile phone with you almost always, but you don't always carry a camera.
From the late 2000s, sales of smartphones exceeded even the wildest forecasts. Digital photos were instant, cheaper, simpler, and cooler. Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter would be the new pioneers of photography, while the old giants, Fujifilm and Kodak, fell further and further behind. Drastic changes needed to be made.
現像ラボって現像するためのラボラトリーです。これは世界中に何百単。こういうものはもう写真の需要が落ちてくるとものすごい巨大な固定費で会社はすぐ赤字になって、どうしようもないからこれリストラクチャリングしなきゃいけないということでリストラクチャリングをやりました。
Komori's New Year's message to his staff in 2006 was particularly ominous. We can't wait any longer. Now is the time to ruthlessly cut production and manufacturing and spare only what is essential.
これはやっぱり人間ですからこう抵抗があるというか嫌だったでしょうね。だったと思います。それはいろんなことはあったと思います。こういうとこはもうこうやって経営がみんな成り立たなくなってきた。あっという間に成り立たなくなる。こういうところからは我々は
In a desperate attempt to survive, Fujifilm slashed costs by over $5 billion. Photo film manufacturing plants were shut down and 5,000 jobs were sacrificed.
これは実際利益も売り上げも全部作りました。でみんなにそれを説明して、さあ行くぞと、さあ行くぞと、これでいけるぞと、やろうと。
Shigetaka Komori, the Fujifilm CEO, had made ruthless cuts to the company in order to survive. With the photo film market crashing at a rate of 30% per year, he now faced an enormous battle to generate new income. It was a battle that the 60-year-old relished.
みんな戦いですよ。我々はコンピューターと市場で戦ってるし、あるいは技術の変換でもこれも戦ってる。それから自分の弱さとも戦わなきゃいけない。飲酒の壁、いろんなものの壁、これと戦って克服していくゲームです。人生はそうだと思います。
Komori came up with a revolutionary battle plan. The company's flagship product, photo film, may have become obsolete, but the technology and expertise behind it could be as relevant as ever.
それから全く新しいことはうちが持っている技術で何ができるだろうかと。 これはそれでも足りない、今言ったようなものだけでは足りないと、もっと足していかなきゃいけないと、2兆3兆の企業だと、それから将来の成長を得るためには
フィルムという商品には寿命があってもですね、それを支えていた技術には寿命はないわけですよね。ですからフィルムを支えていた技術を本質をしっかり抽出してそれを新しい事業に生かすという。
But where did this thinking come from? Komori's early experiences in Fujifilm over 40 years ago may hold the answer. His first job in the company was a project manager, but it appears it wasn't suited to his personality.
私は運動をやってて子供の時から運動が好きだったんでアクティブな人間なんでじっと机に座って一生懸命計算したりとかたりするのはあんまり好きでなかった。なぜこんなとこ来たのかなと、正直な話。
And so Komori asked for a transfer. This new department would shape his thinking and ability to overcome problems.
伝統的なカラーフィルムやカラーペーパーをカメラを売ってるもんじゃなくてフィルムやカメラを作ってきた技術で、そこに配属されてですね、大変やりがいがありました。というのは先輩も何も知らない上司も何も知らない誰も知らない自分でいろいろ勉強していくしかない自分で研究していくしかない。
Fujifilm always knew their technology had the potential for other applications outside of photography. But now, the photofilm crisis had forced their hand and the need to diversify was urgent. In 2006, Komori announced the new business areas Fujifilm would focus on, all completely separate from photography, but all underpinned by a science of photofilm. One of the fields was healthcare.
写真フィルムがどんどん売り上げが落ちていきました。でそれは予想以上に早いものでした。なので中にいるものとしてはこれは非常にまずいなと次に何とかしなきゃいけないなと。なので将来、医薬品をやるとか再生医療に、やるとかっていうことはその当時は全く信じられませんでした。ただし、そういうことができる風土土壌はあるなというふうに思ってまして。
Over nearly a century of research, Fujifilm had amassed a library of over 20,000 chemical compounds. All of them originally developed for photofilm, they would now be the ingredients for Fujifilm's new pharmaceuticals division.
っていうのがなかなか本腰にはならなかったんですけどね、やっぱり危機感というかセンス・オブ・アージェンシーがないとなかなか返信ができないもんでね。でもやっぱりそういう多彩な技術を持ってましたんで、そういう意味でいくと医薬品産業っていうのは一つの、今でもあれですよ、薬の名前は言うと差し支えがあるけれど、我々ケミカルライブラリーが20万種類あるんですね。全部オリジナルのケミカルライブラリーです、カラーフィルムのために。でもこれを製薬会社の方から見たらまさに垂涎の的、よだれがポンと。
In 2006, at a time when Fujifilm was still cutting manufacturing costs, Komori built a new $400 million research facility. It was a big statement, a symbol of the new Fujifilm and its future away from photography.
まずこの建物に驚きました。非常に、大きいし、研究者もいっぱい、研究者技術者もいっぱいいる。でさらに会議室もオープンな感じの場所が多いと。
Crucially, these labs are not for photofilm research. This is a facility focused solely on new business development. The first healthcare products Fujifilm released were vitamin supplements, relatively simple products. But Komori encouraged his team of scientists to innovate even further.
若い研究者が特に俺はこういう薬をやりたい、俺はこういう方法で薬を開発したいということで、まずあります。かなりみんなアグレッシブに、前向きに議論ができました。私どもは医薬品の開発するというところでは、その中でどうやってやったらいいのか。
All of these are clearly driving home a cultural shift in the company of taking more initiative, of being more entrepreneurial. People have to change their mindset, they have to change their behavior, the way they understand the company, the way they see themselves in the company. And this is what I believe Mr. Komori did very well.
But it was the speed at which Komori implemented this plan that was impressive.
こういう危機の中で経営トップがまず決める、それからアクションを起こす、こういうことがスピーディーに行われるっていうことはもう先ほど申し上げた変身といいますか新しい事業をこう早く打ち立てなきゃいけない時にゆっくりやってたらですね、これは変身したことにはならないし。
This was made possible by Komori's strong leadership. He had the unerring ability to execute his strategy through to conclusion and to expect the staff to follow his command without question.
みんなと相談して仲良くやりましょう、多数決で決めましょうじゃない、リーダーが決める。で民主主義でいろんな意見をみんな聞きながらやるとね、例えば企業経営の判断になるとね、角の取れたね、平凡なね、案にしかならない。時間もかかる。遅れてしまう。
So what is interesting about Mr. Komori is he seems to have been precisely the right person at the right time for the company. He was and is strong leader, very driven, very decisive, and takes strong action.
Komori's message of courage resonated with those who entered the research facility, words inspiring change, but also words associated with battle.
経営ってのはあれです。民主主義じゃない、デモクラシーじゃないんです。ディクテーターシップ。これもね、ワイズディクテーターシップじゃないとダメ。だから戦争と同じ。戦争のそういう戦闘の場面でね、リーダーがね、みんな集めて会議するか。
One of the men, or indeed women, accompanying Komori into battle was Tomoko Toshiro. Joining Fujifilm in 2001, she spent the first 5 years of her career developing technology to prevent coloured photo paper from fading. But when she returned from her maternity leave, she was in for a surprise.
2005年に産休を明けて復職をいたしまして、その時に突然といいますか、ちょうど化粧品とかサプリメントとかっていうライフサイエンス事業を始める時期で化粧品をやろうということを言われました。それ自体本当にできるかなというところで驚きました。それぞれ自分の技術は持ってるんだけど、それがこの化粧品とか、サプリメントとかそこでどう活かせるんだろうかというのは多分みんなそれぞれ不安な思いはあったんじゃないかなと思います。
Yes, that's right. Cosmetics. Fujifilm's next venture would quite literally give the company a facelift. In 2007, Fujifilm launched Astalift, a range of high-end skincare products. And, believe it or not, skin cream and photofilm share a lot in common. Collagen, a protein used in the production of photofilm, is also found naturally in the skin.
インクジェットペーパーでも光が当たって色が退色してしまうということがあります。実は私たちの肌でも同じように光が当たるとコラーゲンが壊れてしまうということがありまして、実はそのメカニズムは非常に近いということがあります。
The same technology Toshiro used to prevent color fading on photo paper could also protect human skin from the sunlight.
私やり始めた時に初めは不安があったと先ほど説明しましたが、やり始めると非常に自信につながりました。
The striking case in point is the cosmetics business. It is a rather striking realization that the same chemicals, same processes that help prevent fading of colors in photography also apply to skin and helps prevent skin from sagging and fading. And to be able to use this idea, to be able to take the same chemicals expertise and apply it in a completely different industry is a fabulously interesting insight.
Fujifilm were able to reapply their expertise in producing water-soluble chemicals to create a cream that's easily absorbed into the skin, as Tashiro is about to show us.
水を入れます。
The orange liquid is astaxanthin, the main component in Fujifilm's skin cream.
アスタキサンチン水に溶けないので入れるとこのようにこちらが富士フィルムでナノ化したアスタキサンチンになります。
However, the astaxanthin in the second beaker has been microscopically altered to help it dissolve.
このように水に入れても分離せずにすぐに透明になります。
This is decade-old expertise, developed in the analog photography era, being applied to the modern day. And it has allowed Fujifilm to get a head start in the cosmetics industry.
こういった感じでジェリー状になってます。肌に塗布して伸ばすとスッと素早く浸透します。さっと浸透するのが特徴です。
Komori has transformed Fujifilm from a photography company to a diverse scientific enterprise. Now they produce LCD TV screens, computer storage devices, and printing hardware. But healthcare and cosmetics are the company's most profitable divisions, contributing over $3.3 billion of revenue every year. In the past, photofilm generated 70% of the company's profits. Now it's less than 1%. So one question remains. If photofilm is such a small part of Fujifilm, then why continue to make it at all? Under Shigetaka Komori's strong leadership, Fujifilm had become a cutting-edge and diverse company. Now more likely to produce the cream you put on your face than the film you put in your camera. Yet Fujifilm has never completely turned its back on the product that gave it its name, even though photofilm accounts for less than 1% of its profits.
撤退をしなかったのはね、私どもはわざわざ宣言したんです。写真文化というのは守りますと。いくら小さくなってもダウンサイズしていろんな生産設備やなんかをダウンサイズするで守りますよと。
暗いシーンでもオートで綺麗。
写真の文化というのはさっきも言ったように私は人間にとってなくてはならない文化の一つだと思うんです。だからカラーフィルムなんか今儲かりませんけどまだ作り続けてるということはもう宣言したんです。どんなことがあっても写真はやめないと。
This belief was never more apparent than in the aftermath of Japan's worst natural disaster in recent memory. On March the 11th, 2011, an earthquake struck, causing a tsunami with 30-foot waves on the East Japanese coast. Entire villages were destroyed. Nearly 22,000 people were confirmed dead or missing.
そうですね、あの時震災の現場でね、津波が引いた後、廃墟に貸して、いろんなものが流れ出したり、そこに泥に埋まってたりしたんだけど、人々は掘り返して自分の大事なものを探した。金庫であったり、お金であったり、書類であったり、で一番彼らが一生懸命探したものは写真なんです。
Fujifilm sent 1,500 volunteers to the worst affected areas. Their sole aim, to find, clean and repair photographs and then return them to their owners.
その泥だらけの写真を泥の中から探した写真をウォッシュオフしてで複製してっていうか修理して人たちに広場が公民館でねそこずっと写真を展示してあなたの写真ありませんかということで延べ数百万枚やったのかなもう一回修復してきれいに洗ってあげたというのこれもその写真文化を守るということの一つですけどね。
Such is Fujifilm's faith in the printed image that in 2012 they relaunched one of their analog cameras, the Instax Mini. And here is where the photofilm is produced.
はい、こちらが、インスタント製品の最終パッケージ工程になります。はい。フィルムを作る技術については、富士フィルム独自の技術ですので、情報開示は今しておりません。
The Instax instant camera was a victim of the digital age as consumers rushed to buy digital cameras instead. But now, since its re-release, people are buying them quicker than Fujifilm can make the film.
今石フィルムは需要がお客様からの需要が伸びてますので、24時間1年ほぼ休みなく稼働しています。
The camera underwent a massive makeover. This time it's brighter, cooler, and marketed as the cutest camera in the world. And of course its popularity isn't harmed when Prince Harry is caught using it. Fujifilm set up specialist photo printing shops in trendy parts of Japan, and the manager has witnessed this growth firsthand.
インスタックスはすごく今人気が出ていて、今の若い世代の方々は写真を形にするというものをやったり、写真がすぐ出てくるっていうのを経験したことがない世代なので、今の若い人たちには新鮮っていう形になっているので。
With photos plastered all over the walls, these shops are a homage to the printed image. And remarkably, Fujifilm sell 5 million Instax cameras every year, outselling their digital models 4 times over.
Mobile phones have taken over a very large proportion of the camera business. The sort of point-and-shoot market that was big earlier on is effectively completely gone. And what remains outside of the world of mobile phones is sort of higher-end cameras, but also sort of cool hipster products, the revival of old film technology, like Fuji's very hot-selling current model of Instax instant camera.
Just as vinyl records suddenly became cool and retro, the printed photo has also experienced something of a renaissance.
そういうふうにデジタルばっかりじゃない、アナログの良さもあるよっていう、また戻ってきてる動きもある。そういう動きもあるんだけども、我々はそういう意味で写真文化そのものを支え続けますと。で、最近はそのスマホなんかで撮ってもプリントしない人が多いんだけど、この画像を撮ってるだけ、プリントしないとやっぱりモニュメントとして残らない。で、後で出てきますけども、写真というのはね、もう何て言いますか、要するにその人の人生の瞬間瞬間のね、現実あるいは真実をね、残すものなんです。固定化してモニュメントとして。
And one customer, Sayaka, is doing exactly that.
写真をちょっとプレゼントしようと思っていて、でちょっと写真を選択しているところです。プレゼントというか、お付き合いして1年記念なので、こういう思い出1年間の写真をプレゼントしようかなと。撮った思い出の写真を、こういうハート型にしてプレゼントしようと思ってます。たまにです。だいぶやっぱ少なくはなったんですけど、でもやっぱこうやって可愛くできるので、友人の誕生日とか結婚式とか、そういうプレゼントにはすることはあるかなって感じです。
皆さんプリントするのが初めての方々が多かったりするので、プリントして初めて形にしたものを受け取った時にすごく喜ばれている姿を見た時でしたり、プレゼントするまでワクワクして仕方がないっていう感情を共有させていただいた時がすごくやりがいになる時ですね。
なんとかなりました楽しいですね。振り返りながら1年をこんなことあったなと思いながら。
In 2012, Fujifilm's revenues across all their divisions amounted to over $18 billion. But that same year, their old rivals, Kodak, suffered a rather different fate. They filed for bankruptcy. The company that once exceeded Fujifilm's sales by over 10 times had failed to adapt to the digital age.
彼らは完全にデジタルに変わってしまうって分かった時に、彼らが言ったことは、コダックさんが言ったことはね、我々はデジタルカンパニーになりたいと。We want to be a digital company っていうんですかね、英語で言うと。そういうことだった。でもね、彼らができるなりうるデジタルカンパニーっていうのはどういうデジタルカンパニーかというと、画像のデジタルカンパニーなんです。画像の世界のね。その他の世界ではできない。デジタルカンパニーになろうと思っても、だからそこで我々はそれが分かってたから、単なるデジタルカンパニーだけじゃなくて、 いろいろ多角化してそのマルチプルな事業の構成の会社にしなきゃいけないなと。
Heavily reliant on photo processing right up to their collapse, Kodak's failure was a reluctance to diversify. But diversification on this scale, in a company the size of Kodak, is no easy task.
Changing a company's focus drastically is very, very difficult. You don't become successful unless you're good at doing something. And in order to be good at something, you have to routinize it. You have to be efficient at it. And that, by necessity, builds in inertia. In order to be good at something, you have to effectively structure activities so that they are tailored to doing that, which makes it very difficult to change them to do something else.
But under Komori's leadership, Fujifilm has achieved it. They can now boast a wide portfolio of businesses, not only cosmetics and healthcare, but also LCD screens, computer storage devices, and printing hardware.
例えば自動車屋みたいに自動車だけやってればいい。それから鉄屋みたいに鉄だけやってればいいっていうことではないですね。やっぱり写真フィルムがあった時は写真だけでもよかったかもしれない。それでもうちは多角化してたからね。その他にカメラやったり、いろんなことを他にも広げてたけども、やっぱり技術の多様性が結構うちの会社はあるから、いくつかできることがあります。
Fujifilm have learned from their history. In the company's Tokyo HQ, there's a dedicated space for Fujifilm to showcase and, crucially, develop their future innovations. Innovations that will hopefully keep them one step ahead of the next technological shock.
こちらが富士フイルムのオープンイノベーションハブです。どうぞお入りください。オープンイノベーションハブは、富士フイルムの写真観光材料を、原点としたさまざまな最新のコア技術開発してきたテーマ。この場所は富士フイルムの80周年を記念をして第2の創業を加速するために開設をいたしました。
And their innovation network has grown wider than just Tokyo.
こちらのオープンイノベーションハブはアメリカはシリコンバレーに昨年の6月に、オランダはティルバーグに今年の1月にオープンをしました。今グローバルの3極体制で運営をしております。
This relentless focus on innovation has allowed Fujifilm to push the boundaries of pharmaceuticals. The company is developing stem cells capable of reproducing human tissue and also trialling a drug to treat Ebola.
それを取り込んで今はがん、神経変性疾患、それから、感染症、これを中心にやってて、その中でもアンメットニーズメディカル、さらにオンリーワンの薬を開発しているという状況。
All this is a far cry from the photofilm company Komori joined half a century ago. And with plans to spend over $1 billion on research in 2017, the future of Fujifilm looks safe in his hands.
だからむしろ製薬会社にない強みがそこにあるのかなと。さっき言ったバイオ医薬なんかの生産技術とね、リージェネラティブもそうだけども、この生産技術はキーですね。こういうもの、それから今言ったDDS の技術とかいう。で一つ一つ踏み出していって。他ので出ない間は他でヒットを打って、チーム会社としてマルチプルビジネスで育っていくと、進行させていくという。